Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, and to today's webinar on Iran-Shia diplomacy, a conversation with Dr. Edward Wasnich. My name is Peter Mandeville, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the Berkeley Center. Today's event is part of a larger project that we've been conducting here at the Berkeley Center called the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power. This project, which is sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, is a comparative exploration of various ways in which a variety of state governments around the world incorporate aspects of religion and religious engagement into their broader external relations. The project has been publishing a wide range of commentary articles, events, and longer working papers. And we have a couple of edited books that will be coming out of the project over the next couple of years. Iran is, of course, a country that has been of particular interest to our work in this project, and that's why we're absolutely delighted today to be hosting this event. Today's discussion is part of a series that we're running over the course of this fall, with each of these sessions tied to a recently published policy brief on 5 different countries that tend to be of particular strategic interest to foreign policy practitioners and foreign affairs professionals. So far, we've looked at India and Turkey earlier in the series. We'll be talking about Iran today, and later this fall, we'll be looking at China and then Russia. The author of the recently published policy brief coming out of the project on Iran is with us today. That's Dr. Edward Wasnich, senior lecturer in the Open University in the UK. And in order to maximize the time that we have with him today, I'm not going to read out his full bio, but rather in the chat room, I will put up a series of links to this event, to the landing page for our broader project, if you'd like to look at some of the other outputs and publications that have come out. I've also put up a link to the policy brief that Dr. Wasnich will be addressing today, and I've also put up a link to his bio so that you can learn more about him and his very interesting work. I want to briefly touch on just a couple of housekeeping items about the format for today's discussion. First of all, I wanted to let you know that the session will be recorded, particularly for the benefit of those who have not been able to join us live. And those of you who have already registered to attend the event and are here with us today will also receive a link to that video once it goes live. At the end of Dr. Wasnich's remarks, we will have some time available for question and answers and discussion. And the way that will work is that if you look at your Zoom screen, if you look at the controls, you should see a function called Q&A. As we get towards the end of his remarks, and even during the remarks, if you wish, you will be able to type questions into that box. And then as we go into the discussion portion of today's event, I will select and read out some of those questions for Dr. Wasnich to respond to. So that's how things will work today. And without further ado, I want to offer a huge and warm welcome to Edward Wasnich. Eddie, thank you so much for being with us today, and welcome.
A pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Peter. It's always a great honor to be involved in this project, and it's been a couple of years now since I was over with you in DC, and it's a shame we couldn't do this in person, but actually, you know, this is a really good opportunity to have lots of people come and attend and join you in this, so really appreciate it. So I guess I'll just crack on, yeah? Okay, thanks. Right, so the paper I'm presenting today, as Peter mentioned, it's drawing on the policy briefing that he's very kindly shared in the chat box. So I'm just going to be talking through that, and at the end I'll give you some, share my screen and give you some examples of kind of the thing I'm talking about as well, in terms of how Iran enacts its cultural and religious diplomacy, looking at the example of an organization called the Islamic Cultural and Relations Organization and the work they do in Lebanon. But before we go into the kind of the more empirical material, I'm just going to set the scene a bit for us. So as many of the attendees here will know, if people have an interest in Iran, since the founding of the Islamic Republic, Iran's leaders have sought to, I suppose, harness quite universalistic and on the one hand, and also quite particularistic claims to legitimacy in the Muslim world. And this began with attempts to actively export the Islamic Revolution in the 1980s. And from that point, Iran invested in building its diplomatic and its religious infrastructure, expanding its religious outreach activities across the Muslim world and amongst Shia communities in particular. And that really drew upon its position as something of what I've described as a Shi'i metropole, as a way of demonstrating its growing soft power. And this is something that the Islamic Republic also translates into its wider international diplomacy, drawing on common themes of fighting oppression in its efforts to build links with the global south, for example, and resist US dominance in world affairs. And so what I'm going to give today in this overview, I'm going to explore the way in which religious identity informs the diplomacy and ultimately the foreign policy of the world's preeminent theocracy. And I want to highlight how what are really important in Iranian foreign policy are these religiously grounded notions of justice and resistance to oppression, which I think inform a lot of its foreign policy thinking and diplomatic outreach. And when we're looking at studies of Iranian foreign policy and diplomacy, we often see a common conflation of religion and revolutionary aspects, but without much probing into how this is articulated. So regularly, as you all know, we see very simplistic analyses that will just say, Iran is a malign actor seeking to spread its ideology and or its religion. The repeated accusations of sectarianism from US allies in the region that we see leveled against Iran regularly. The truth, as any informed observer will know, is obviously far more complex. What Iran does in terms of its cultural and religious diplomacy, which we'll highlight some small aspects of today, is part of a multifaceted and really complex foreign policy that utilizes many different aspects depending on the audience in question or on the cause that is seeking to advance. And religion is just one part of that. But I think it does help us understand the combined spiritual and political mission of Iran in global politics. And for the Islamic Republic, there's this strong ethical and moral implications for how an international affairs should be understood and conceived. And so some of that finds its articulation in elements of its cultural and religious diplomacy as well. So as I touched on briefly initially, the Islamic Republic contains a range of what I've termed parastatal organizations. So these are state-run organizations which carry out religious outreach and soft power projection across the Muslim world. And these don't only take the form of traditional religious activities affiliated to the seminaries, but they also involve wider educational and diplomatic missions undertaken abroad by the Iranian government. So in this, we can see how the wider transnational linkages associated with Iran's position as a religious hub are used as a sort of vector to enhance diplomatic relations and then deepen ties with communities across the Shi'i world, but also the Muslim world more broadly. Before we go on to some of the more kind of concrete examples of how this is done, I think it's worth just pausing to reflect on the notion of justice and how this is a very important facet of Iran's foreign policy. The Islamic Republic's views on justice are formed really by a particular framing of injustice, and that arises from two interrelated points. Firstly, it's to do with the historical framing of Iranian political Islam as an ideal that draws on the religio-philosophical heritage of Shi'ism, and with it the ideas of rallying against injustice. And secondly, the subsequent position as a result of this kind of heritage of the Islamic Republic as a historically counter-hegemonic power, and as one that's often chafed against Western-defined norms in the international system, of course. So we often see in studies of Iranian foreign policy, this kind of fluctuation between, pragmatism and idealism, in Iranian foreign policy. But there's lots of continuities, and this notion of justice is actually a very strong one, and it's a continual thread that's been maintained in Iran's diplomacy since 1979. And it shows an ongoing desire to maintain a heritage of the revolution. There's a noted Iranian political scientist, Homera Moshehzadeh, whose work I'm a big fan of, and she encapsulates this quite well. She notes, this is in an article where she talks about Iran's nuclear program during the Ahmadinejad era, but I think it's a very key point. She says that justice is a form of a kind of a meta discourse that gives a meaning to Iranian foreign policy in general. And we can see this, the fight against oppression was key in Khomeini's thinking, of course. Quoting directly from him here, he encourages an Islam that repudiates oppression and an Islam in which to rule and the people are from the lowest walks of life and are equal before law. Key to his political thought was this emphasis on a type of Islam, again quoting Khomeini, whose standard bearers are the barefooted, the oppressed and the poor people of the world. And that was a form of political Shi'ism, very much a modernist interpretation, but it drew on the intellectual heritage of modernizers within Shi'ism, Ali Shariati, al-Assad, people like that. And the emphasis, this kind of emphasis on a sort of populist egalitarianism saw Khomeini and before him Shariati reviving and invoking the Quranic term of the Mustazafin, the oppressed, again, which is familiar to people who have studied Iran's recent political history. And that's a key term, of course, that went on to play a key role in the Iranian Revolution. And it's very important in a foreign policy sense as well, as we'll discuss. So how does this religious identity manifest itself in Iran's foreign policy and diplomacy? The work of Hushain Shahabi, the noted historian of modern Iran, I think is very useful here. He schematizes the way in which the Islamic Republic reflects this thinking within its foreign policy by referring to three concentric circles. So he says that support for the oppressed starts with an outer circle of so-called third world countries and liberation movements. Then we have a middle circle comprising the Muslim world. And then with Shi'i Muslims forming the inner circle. Now, the ways in which this support continues to be articulated to this inner circle, to the Shia, can be seen in its well-documented recent strategic engagements, but also in its religious and cultural diplomacy in the region as well. And this emphasis on fighting oppression manifests itself in a counter-hegemonic discourse that seeks to challenge perceived US imperialism in the Middle East and beyond. So we see Iran utilizing a discourse in its cultivation of ties with other similarly minded states and causes in global politics. And that ranges from its well-known support for the Palestinian cause, its close relations with leftist movements and governments such as Venezuela and Bolivia previously, and also in the recent key figures, rather gleeful vocal support of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US as well. So there's a sort of opportunity there as well. But Iran acting as the protector of the Shia is an important aspect of its foreign policy, although it's far from, I'd say, being the only consideration in its regional outreach. And as I've mentioned, and I keep on saying, it tends to be multifaceted depending on the audience in question. But this is an outlook that's shaped Iran's recent military engagements in Syria and Iraq, of course, alongside the more conventionally understood national security concerns. So Iran, felt duty bound to act in its very own war on terror, utilized this kind of it co-opted this phrasing from the US war on terror to kind of provide a reason for its involvement in protecting the Shia in Iraq and also in fighting Daesh more broadly. And despite these appeals to Shi'i identity by the Islamic Republic, I think their tactical employment in the region, in the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, for example, is, I think, born primarily of realpolitik considerations in countering perceived Saudi hostility and the objectives of specific extremist groups who carry out, who are sectarian actors in their own right. Iran's involvement in those two conflicts, I think, has strong geopolitical, strategic rationale, really, in terms of preserving its interests, maintaining its national security, the well-worn discussions around strategic depth and land bridges and that kind of thing as well. But I think, religion does have a useful role to play in terms of attracting volunteer fighters, shrine defenders, that kind of thing. So what we see in this sort of more harder military involvement, which I'll leave here before moving on to the more softer cultural diplomacy stuff, just the final point is that these are essentially religious overlays in a sense. So these serve as a useful justification for its actions. And so there's a kind of instrumental drawing upon these transnational linkages to provide additional depth and meaning to more strategic objectives. I'm going to move on now to the main bulk of what we're talking about and what's really most relevant to I think to Peter's wider project as well. And this is the religious soft power channels that Iran utilizes. Iran is particularly active in countries or among communities where it has shared strategic objectives in addition to common religious ties. And as we'll discuss in the case study of the ICRO, this draws upon long-standing ties, for example, in Lebanon with Lebanese Shia communities, and is furthered through shared aims of promoting resistance to combat Israeli and US goals in the region. Aside from the ICRO, there are a number of different religious soft power channels that Iran utilizes in its broader international affairs, though. So just as some brief examples, we have the Imam Khomeini Relief Foundation, MDAD. It's one of the largest charitable foundations in Iran. It primarily focuses on domestic charitable work, but it also historically had a very active international arm, and they carried out various development projects across the Muslim world. We have other groups such as the Ahlul Bayt World Assembly. This is a grouping that brings scholars and religious leaders from across the global Shi'i community together every 4 years for a conference in Tehran. And it also has operations in other countries as well, often in conjunction with the ICRO. Then there's also the Assembly for the Proximity of Islamic Schools of Thought, which is a yearly conference which is organized by the Iranian government in Tehran. And that assembly aims to promote greater unity across the various sects that make up the Islamic Ummah. So this is, people are invited from across the Muslim world. And these are kind of important organizations that the Islamic Republic utilizes in its global religious outreach, diplomacy, and indeed development work. And Iran also supports religious education across the world in various colleges and centers. So we have the Al-Mustafa International University, that's based in Qom, holy city in Iran. And that provides religious training and education for non-Iranians from across the globe. So it operates a number of affiliate colleges and centers internationally too, including here in the UK. But I mean, if you're fortunate enough to go to Qom, you can see that it's actually a very cosmopolitan place, and you have religious scholars from across the world there. And there's various printing houses like Al-Huda and others which distribute materials and operate in conjunction with the various religious and cultural outreach centers that Iran operates across the world. So to come to the main kind of example, which I've looked at in some of my work previously and in this policy brief, this is the Islamic Culture and Relations Organization, the ICRO. And they're a noteworthy actor in terms of projecting Iran's soft power, particularly amongst Shi'i communities worldwide, because they're the main channel for extending Iran's diplomatic reach through cultural diplomacy initiatives. They are Iran's cultural diplomacy arm, essentially. Now, the ICRO run Iran's cultural bureaus abroad. They have a particular focus on the Muslim world, but they also operate in non-Muslim contexts as well. In the host countries in which they operate, the ICRO acts as a kind of base from which Iran's cultural attaches, which are known as cultural counselors, it's the base from which they carry out their work. And I think it's important to note that at this point that the ICRO, they operate separately from the diplomats that are employed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who run the country's embassies abroad. The ICRO affiliated to the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, but crucially, its ruling council report directly to Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei. So in a way, they operationalize Iran's soft power through sponsoring various cultural events, collaborations in the countries in which they operate. And they have quite a broad remit in terms of the collaborations they can do. So I was fortunate enough to conduct a bit of research in Lebanon and was able to look at the work of the ICRO out there. And they have a very active cultural center in Beirut. They sponsored numerous cultural and artistic events in Lebanon. And I'll show an example of one of the things that I was fortunate enough to attend there a few years back. And although a lot of their work and the work of the ICRO more broadly is, say, aimed at Iranian expat communities or based on religious commemorations, for example, they're very active in Lebanon, certainly in cultural production work that reinforces the notion of the axis of resistance. And most of you will know this, of course, but the axis of resistance being the alliance of Iran, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Syria, and also at times certain Palestinian factions against Israel, the United States, and their allies. And the kind of work that the ICRO do in Lebanon, and the sort of the the nature of it, I think, highlights the continued significance of core revolutionary ideals around fighting injustice that are rooted actually in the modern political Shi'ism of the Islamic Republic. The cultural attaché, the cultural council of who was running the cultural center in Iran a few years back, Mr. Shariat Badar, he noted that the cultural dimension of the idea of resistance, I'm quoting him here, is part of Iran's foreign policy and therefore is intrinsic in the relations between the two countries. So, he sees that as being, a kind of core reason or core sort of driver of a lot of the work they do. He told me that they have a lot of leeway in terms of the people that they collaborate with. So they can collaborate with a range of different artistic organizations. The only proviso is that they don't obviously collaborate with groups that might be pro-Israel, for example. I mean, that wouldn't be the case in Lebanon, but, in terms of the other work that the ICRO do, as long as it doesn't conflict with the aims of foreign policy aims of the Islamic Republic, they have quite a broad remit. But I think what we see in a lot of the work they're doing, and this is for Iranian foreign policy more broadly, is really a repurposing of the revolutionary vanguard role, which was cultivated in the early years of the Islamic Republic, where originally we saw this export of the revolution. Now we see Iran in this context crafting a role that sees itself as constituting the hub of resistance to Israeli and US policies in the region. And if I can just share my screen quickly, because I can give you some examples of the kind of thing. So this is some examples from a resistance art event, which I was able to attend at the invitation of the ICRO, organized by themselves at the UNESCO Palace in Beirut. So these are examples of resistance art, which by and large were produced by Iranian artists, although there's some artists from across the globe present their work as well, among common themes related to resistance. So these are just some examples here. You have the equating of ISIS with Israel, for example, the ISIS with the dollar signs here, noting the alleged US complicity in their rise, and also the Yemeni cause here being tied to the resistance narrative as well. This example being, a caricature of an ISIS fighter, a Daesh fighter, and with the badges, the flags of Israel, US, and Saudi Arabia on there. Crude, but clearly giving a very strong message. And this macabre volleyball scene, again by an Iranian artist, which shows the defenseless people of Yemen falling victim to the bombings of in which the US and its allies are complicit in, and then we have the Israeli, Saudi, Emirati flags. Interestingly, the Qatari flag there as well. That's wouldn't be topical now. All aided and abetted by Uncle Sam, and also the levers of British soft power and CNN adjudicated by the UN in their favour. So another example there of that kind of work which is promoted at these kind of events. So sort of strong political caricatures, I would say. But there's wider work that the ICRO does. This is an example from a few years ago, but I mean they are still continuing to do lots of work. So just to show how this resistance theme finds its way into other work, if you can see that there, that is taken from the ICRO's website. This is a meeting of resistance scholars in Baghdad back in February, March this year. And it was very, I mean, I won't go through the quotes now, but it was essentially the central theme was the Palestinian cause within that, and the liberation of Al-Quds and that kind of thing. So again, tying kind of elements of this religious diplomacy with a very strong message in terms of resistance as well. It's worth noting, I mean, the ICRO's website as well, there is an English equivalent of that as well, but it's not updated very often if you want to ever go and have a look at it. So the Persian and the Arabic versions are much more up to date. I'll just stop that now. So I think the point with this is that organizations such as the ICRO, but the wider religious outreach arms of the Iranian state, they play an important role in helping cement these transnational religious links between Iran and the wider Muslim world. And as I mentioned, these don't always just take the form of these traditional religious activities affiliated to the seminaries, but they also involve this wider educational and diplomatic missions undertaken by the Iranian government abroad. And I think we can see, therefore, how those transnational linkages, which are fostered by Iran, have developed as a result of its position as a religious hub, and they're then used as essentially a vector, I suppose, to enhance diplomatic relations and deepen ties with communities across the Muslim world and amongst Shia communities in particular. And this is an aspect, of course, of Iran's foreign policy and diplomacy that is multifaceted and complex. It really combines religious soft power projection and cooperation, along with its own national security concerns and its kind of core values as well. And I think that the primary example I discussed here with the ICRO in Lebanon and the work it does around resistance, these are things that are very much in the cultural domain, but they help amplify narratives that are sometimes based on religiously defined notions of fighting oppression. But then it synthesizes these with wider geopolitical concerns, as we see in its contribution towards these resistance-themed activities in Lebanon and the wider Middle East as well. And I think ultimately this outreach and development of these types of organizations operating across the world, of which the ICRO is just one example, I think they highlight a complex and multi-layered articulation of Iran's combined spiritual and political mission in global politics. And I'll leave it at that.
Eddie, wonderful. Thank you so much for such a rich presentation. And it was wonderful to kind of have some of the kind of ground textures of this visible to us through the slides that you shared. So we're going to move over to the question and answer period of the event today. Again, for those of you who'd like to raise some issues or pose some questions to our speaker, if you look down at your Zoom controls, you'll see a function labeled Q&A. If you open that, that will open a box, and that will allow you to type in any questions that you'd like to pose to Dr. Wasnich. So please go ahead and start using that function. I'm also in the chat box. I'm going to throw up again a set of links related to this event, including a link to the policy brief of Dr. Wasnich's that we just published late last month, as well as a link to the landing page to the broader project, the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, of which this event is part. You'll also find a link to Dr. Wasnich's bio there. Got a couple of questions coming in. I wonder if I might start, though, Eddie, by asking you to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of the strategic planning and coordination side of this work. I've just noted in my own kind of explorations of the differential approaches that various countries take to incorporating religious engagement and religious outreach into their work, the Iranians seem to have a very kind of nuanced sense of who their audience is a lot of the time. I just, there's bits of religious outreach work in the kind of form of cultural diplomacy that I encountered in places like in Indonesia that just, seem to reflect a very professionalized sense of know your audience. And I'm just wondering, how does that piece of the picture come together? Is there a sort of centralized policy and strategic planning unit within the ICRO? Is it really left to the specific ground expertise of Iranian embassies around the world? How does that nuance come about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember your example of seeing that in Indonesia, actually, from when we first met, and it's a fascinating one. I think that really is a very true and clear reflection of exactly how nuanced it is. The organizationally, I mean, the ICRO has a number of different kind of sub areas. And so variously they have, within Iran itself, they have different directorates dealing with interreligious dialogue, which hosts lots of things in Iran, which again, there's lots of kind of crossover with the other organizations I mentioned as well. they will have lots of different areas. There's whole sections that, like I say, interreligious dialogue. We have that whole directorates on Persian language and literature. The ICRI will often be will almost always be the site of where Persian language instruction happens in foreign countries abroad. So they offer very cheap free courses. They used to offer them in the UK when they had an office here in London. So they have all of those different areas, which obviously managed centrally from Iran, but then within the countries in question is where they exercise a lot of freedom, really, in terms of who they reach out to. But as I said, it's always contingent on making sure it aligns with Iran's foreign policy priorities. So you're not going to get them collaborating with anything that's government affiliated with the US or Israel, for example. But I was told in my conversations that they have a lot of freedom in terms of arts organizations that they collaborate with and stuff like that, and they will tailor their message to the audience in question. And so why the example of Lebanon, it's a very obvious one, obviously, because of the well-established links with the Lebanese Shia, but it's just interesting there, that it's not just based on the religious link. It's really tapping into the notion of resistance as well, combining the two. And so, a lot of the sort of product that's produced in terms of stuff on the ground that happens beyond kind of religious commemoration is very much, cultural or artistic articulations of resistance and how that happens. And in doing so, they will collaborate with Hezbollah's cultural production unit as well, for example. That's a natural fit, but you have similar kind of collaborations in other countries as well. So yeah, central planning, central organization that's run along many different lines, that does things from within Iran, but then a fair amount of autonomy in the countries in question. And interestingly, these are, as I mentioned, they're separate from the embassies as well. So they operate from separate premises most of the time as well. And they're not under the purview of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So a very different aspect of kind of cultural relations that you might see with other countries, where there's a closer working relationship, I'd say.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really helpful. Questions rolling in very nicely now. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of squish together a couple of questions that have here a certain certain common thread. So you mentioned that, that much of what Iran does in this space is ultimately kind of guided by its perceived geopolitical interests. And so, we have Angela Miotto asking you for your thoughts on how Iran's position is advanced through, for example, denying the Holocaust and refusing to recognize Israel. And I'll sort of attach to that, if he doesn't mind, Ben Tua's point about the fact that there obviously is a Jewish population in Iran itself, and he wonders to what extent does Iranian diplomacy include presentations of the position and role of Jewish communities in Iran.
Okay, yeah, good questions. Thank you both for that. Yeah, well, I mean, the Holocaust denial thing is only one side, one element of political discourse in Iran, and it's you can argue whether it's marginalized or not. I mean, certainly under Ahmadinejad, you had, Holocaust denial conferences taking place in Iran, with invitees from across the world, which I think left a very bad taste in the mouth. But you saw a completely different attitude when the current administration came into power on that. So I would say it's really a fringe element of the discourse now, although it's not to say it wasn't prominent earlier on, but I think a lot of key Iranian political figures, certainly in the current administration, would not be comfortable with anything in terms of Holocaust denial. But of course, that a separate issue, of course, is the recognition of Israel. Iran does not recognize Israel's right to exist as a state, and it ties its foreign policy very much to the Palestinian cause, and the whole notion of resistance is the Palestinian cause is intrinsic within that as well. So that is their kind of primary focus on that. The second question was more related to Iran's own Jewish community, which, as most people know, is one of the largest in the Middle East outside Israel, or it's not the largest. And that is something which, it's not necessarily relevant to, well, it is relevant, but it's not part of kind of a discussion on cultural diplomacy as I'm presenting here. But it's a very good point, and it is something that, we have narratives again from Iranian political figures that emphasize this fact regularly as well, to say, and it's used, as a means of countering accusations of anti-Semitism, because we have no problem with the Jewish people. There's, the Jewish people live peacefully and fine here in Iran. We have representatives in parliament, so they don't equate Judaism with Israel in the same sense. So, so I think it's used as a retort to deflect accusations, of anti-Semitism.
Okay, great. We have a question now from Abbas, who says the following. If we consider the changes in Iran's foreign policy in relation to the changes in its domestic policy, it seems that justice was a central signifier only in the policy of exporting the revolution in the first decade of the Islamic Revolution. It seems that after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran pursued a kind of national Shi'ism, under which foreign policy was also subject. But after the failure of this policy, especially after the reform government in Iran, we're witnessing the formation of a new type of transnational Shi'ism. How do you assess the centrality of justice in this new transnational policy? In your opinion, what are the central categories of this new policy?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Abbas. Great question. And I mean, yes, I kind of briefly alluded to this idea before, of this kind of vacillation between kind of idealism and pragmatism, where you talk about the idealistic phase of the including the export of the revolution. National Shi'ism, I suppose. My argument here is that justice remains an important thread. That's the point I was trying to make. So yes, you have fluctuations in the foreign policy discourses, but justice remains a continual thread that allows successive governments, whether they're reformist or whether they're more conservative minded, to claim a kind of direct ideological inheritance, or I suppose legitimacy would be the word I'm looking for, actually, a kind of drawing legitimacy from a core revolutionary precept, which finds its articulation in its foreign policy. And that can be married very neatly with issues like fighting oppression, which is why the resistance narrative feeds in so nicely into that. And I think if you're talking about a transnational Shi'ism, yes, that's something that's existed for a very long time. It's something that's found perhaps a more overt articulation recently, because it's been invoked in some more kind of strategic and hard military engagements as well, and so you see this kind of combination of the kind of spiritual and material, I suppose. So I think justice maintains its importance. It still remains a central core, and it allows that kind of people to lay claim to that inheritance from the revolution. I hope that answers the question. Sorry, it's a bit of a rambling answer, but yeah.
No, that's fine, Eddie. Thank you. So I've got a question now that comes from, it looks like a combined screen name, or perhaps a shared account with the names Espinosa, Tischler, and Yael Sierra on it. And the crux of the question is in relation to the role that Hezbollah plays in the context of Iran's external relations. Obviously, Hezbollah allows a certain kind of conduit, particularly into Lebanon's Shia communities. And so this question is asking whether there are ways that Hezbollah also allows Iran to connect with non-Shia communities, religious communities in Lebanon at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, yeah, the key kind of part of that is the constituency is the Shia communities in Lebanon. So the work that Iran does with Hezbollah in terms of cultural production work is through Hezbollah's cultural production arm, an association called Risalat. Much of their work, I mean, yes, elements of it, again, much like the RCRO, elements of it are built around core religious themes important to Shiism and commemorations, but a lot of it is based on notions of resistance and commemorating resistance fighters, particularly in relation to combat in Israel. So I think the way it's then posed is that this is supporting Lebanon's the nation rather than just one community, and so you have this in the discourse coming from Hezbollah as well. I'm not an expert on the movement at all, but in the kind of conversations I've had around it and with people working for them and in Hezbollah, it's about pitching the message as a Lebanese fight against against Israel, and that the resistance is a Lebanese national issue, and that's how it's pitched in those terms. So I guess it's framing it in that kind of national struggle as opposed to purely religious terms, although the religious element can have some relevance to that as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So this is another case where I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions, and I want to maybe provide a little bit of comparative context for it. One thing I've noticed in my own study of Saudi Arabia's religious propagation and da'wah activities are a number of instances where Saudi religious attachés based at some of their embassies around the world who are accredited as professional diplomats, but not actually professional diplomats, sometimes engage in activities that are not necessarily well aligned with the way that the Saudi Foreign Ministry understands its interests and equities in that same country. And obviously the interests of the Saudi religious establishment and the Saudi Foreign Ministry sometimes converge, sometimes they diverge. And so we have a couple of participants today who are asking a similar question with respect to the relationship between ICRO and the formal diplomats of the Islamic Republic. So Ong Keng Yong says, how are the dynamics between the professional diplomats of Iran and the ICRO representatives? I suppose they coordinate somewhat on promoting relations with foreign countries they're posted to. And then Marco Ferrario kind of articulates it as, if ICRO reports to the Supreme Guide and the diplomats to the government, do they ever get in conflict with each other?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. I mean, not in an open way, certainly not in the same way that you would see within, Iran in terms of different political factions emphasizing different centers of power, which is quite a lively and open debate within Iran. So it's not something I've witnessed myself, although obviously I've not, been to every ICRO center and interviewed everyone like that, much as I'd love to. But I think that naturally that there could easily be a tension there if they are pursuing different aims. But the ICRO's work is very much in that kind of cultural domain. So they are diplomats. I mean, but they are very much cultural attachés, and so yes, you could infer some difference in perhaps some of the output that they might be sponsoring, but it's not something that I've ever noticed is particularly overt. It's just that they have different emphases. So the emphasis will be on the case I've come back to with Lebanon, on resistance or on religious commemoration, or in another country, on another form of cultural commonality. So we look at their work in Tajikistan, it's very much about, kind of common cultural, linguistic commonalities and common cultural figures there. far removed often from the politics. I think Lebanon is an interesting example where the politics actually comes very close, to a lot of the cultural work they do, whereas in other contexts it's a lot further apart. But I think in the instance of Lebanon, they're singing from that same hymn sheet anyway. But I think there's potential, obviously, for different views. But I think the emphasis, as I say, is different. So it's not something I've seen much conflict in abroad anyway. They tend to behave themselves. Yeah.
Okay. Just to add a little bit more granularity to this, one of the original questioners on this line, Ong Keng Yong, kind of further specifies or further kind of asks, do the ICRO personnel and the Iranian diplomats kind of engage with the same organizations, the same civil society groups, or do they kind of operate in different worlds?
It depends on the context in question. I think in the case of somewhere like Lebanon, Iraq as well, there's probably more similarity. But I think if you're looking at the type of stuff that happened, say when they were operating in the UK, or perhaps in the Indonesian case, for example, it was very different. So we'd have representatives, for example, from the ICRO who'd come to academic conferences and things like that. Very interested in Persian studies more broadly in the UK, that kind of thing. As some ambassadors have been as well, but certainly the current one is. But I think that they're kind of more switched on to the sort of academic side of things, perhaps a little bit more than diplomats might be. They're busy doing other things, I suppose. So there is a differentiation, but it's an interesting point, and it makes you realise that I think where the sort of spiritual and political mission comes very close together. I think you see more collaboration in that regard. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have a question from Tehseen now about Pakistan. Tehseen observes that obviously there is a Shia population in Pakistan, and sectarianism, is an important facet of socio-political dynamics in South Asia. And Tehseen notes that Shia organizations in Pakistan do have links to Iran, and kind of wonders about how we should understand the relationship between kind of cultural diplomacy and Iranian soft power activities in a context like Pakistan, where where sort of appearing to emphasize certain communal identities, often has a direct link to increased temperatures around sectarian issues. In other words, is this a deliberate policy? Is this just a sort of byproduct of what are actually intended to be just sort of soft power affinity type activities?
I think the driving force for a lot of these initiatives and why Iran is involved, say in the Pakistani case. I mean, actually, Pakistan was host to the highest number of ICRO offices anywhere in the world up until recently. There's many different cultural centers there on account of the large Shia population, but it was I don't think there was any pernicious intent there. I think it's reaching out to communities. I think it's seeking to gain influence in the way that it can. But I think it's very easy to kind of throw the sectarianizing label there. I mean, just because a state, has identity markers in its foreign policy and in its domestic politics, and it's very, very clear in Iran's case, it's the world's only proper theocracy, so that's there. But just because these things are present, it doesn't mean that they're promoting sectarianism. Iran sees itself as a victim of sectarianism. We have to remember that as well. As the kind of supporter of the minority sect within Islam. So the Iran's pronouncements on this kind of issue are very much that we are fighting our own war on terror, as I said, against sectarian actors that are supported by the West, by Saudi Arabia, etc. So I think, I mean, there was a note in that question as well about, sort of proxy actors as well. And again, I just think we need to be a little bit careful using these phrases, because you're denying complete agency on the ground there as well. Pakistani Shia have their own range of causes and concerns, and some of those will be aligned with Iran's interests as a Shia power, and others will be completely different. So I think we've got to be careful not to overstate that role. I think there's only limited things they can do. I don't think they have a kind of broader proselytizing mission or anything like that. But it's very easy, it's a very easy thing to label it as.
Okay, no, and thank you for that clarification and nuance. I wonder though, just to kind of push a little bit further down that same vein, aside from the question of, Iranian intentionality or the proxy versus, local agency dimensions of Shia groups in Pakistan, I wonder to what extent do these kinds of well-developed transnational ties to Iran on the part of certain minority groups facilitate the ability of local majority groups, in this case Sunni groups, to represent them as being somehow foreign or being, to kind of denationalize them and question their Pakistan-ness? And is Iran aware of that dimension when it sort of does this kind of outreach?
Well, I think so. I think so. I think that's a really valid point. It's something you do see, and there's this, constant fear of a Shia fifth column. We see it, in the actions of the Saudi government, the Bahraini government, and certain sections in Pakistan, for example. And I think, yes, that Iran is certainly aware of that, but Iran does have a lot of nuance in its foreign policy, so it's not going to risk cordial relations with Pakistan over some cultural centers. It has a very complicated relationship with Pakistan anyway, but Iran has no interest in antagonizing Pakistan either. And so I think it's cognizant of that. I mean, you look at Iran's response to the issue of Kashmir. It's not, the hugest advocate for Kashmir, despite its appeals to Islamic unity and this being a key Muslim cause. So, because it has to maintain that balance in relations with Pakistan and with India as well. So this is, where the geopolitical comes in and kind of tempers a lot of that as well.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'll just add that my kind of point of comparison for this, interestingly enough, is actually activities on the part of American organizations, U.S. organizations focused on the protection of Christian minorities in the Middle East, who I think are not always aware of the extent to which their efforts to kind of protect Christian groups actually exacerbate the extent to which those are perceived as being foreign or aligned with the West, even though the intention is to protect and defend.
No, I think it's a really good point, and I can't say for definite because, again, I'm not an expert on Pakistan, but I can see that situation being mirrored. Certainly, I can't. It's not malign intent there, but I think it can definitely have that effect. Yeah.
Okay. So our next question comes from Bahman Bakhtiari. Bahman, it's great to see you here. Thanks for joining us. And he actually asks about a topic that I'd hoped would come up. He says, "Thank you for this informative presentation. Could you elaborate on how Iran's Shia diplomacy has impacted its relations with Iraq, particularly considering the views of the senior Iraqi Shia leader Ayatollah Sistani and his influence on the Shias and his differences with Iran's supreme leader?"
Okay, well, I mean, it's a huge factor, of course. I mean, as I sort of briefly touched on it, it helped drive, I think, a lot of, add kind of additional depth to its engagement within Iraq and its help with the Iraqi government of fighting Daesh. So I think it's an important facet of that. In terms of the Sistani issue, I mean, this is a complicated thing because we have no way of quantifying the notion of marja'iyat, so we have Khamenei as a marja for many millions of Shia across the world, and we have Sistani as well. Again, I think Iran is incredibly sensitive to this. It has a strong hand in Iraq, but again, it's far too easy just to say Iran controls all of the popular mobilization forces. They're all Iranian proxies, and the truth is far more complex, and it only really has very strong links with a few of them. So the links are there, they're strong, but I think must not underestimate the agileness and the tactfulness of Iranian diplomats, and they're fully cognizant of the fact that there are very important religious links there that can be an advantageous for Iran, but it can also cause it problems if it's ever seen as overstepping the mark, and if it's ever seen as challenging Sistani's authority. So I think it's really complex. But I mean, there's such a crossover between them. I mean, I was fortunate enough when I was in Qom to go to an audience with Sistani's representative in Qom. So he has representatives in Iran as well, just as Iran has representatives in Najaf. So there's a lot of a kind of I wouldn't say cross-pollination, but a lot of understanding of each other's positions, and a lot of very careful balancing that goes on. So it's not really an answer. I think it's just that there's a full awareness there. Yes, it's an important element of relations, but I think Iran is careful not to tread on his toes too much, I think.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions to go. We're coming up on it's 1:26, and so I'm going to kind of close off the question box fairly soon. So if anyone would like to pose a question to Dr. Wasnich, please do go ahead and get it into the chat box in the next minute or so before I close it off. So this next question comes from Alan Saunders, who asks about a sort of different flank of the Iranian near abroad. You did touch in passing, I think, on ICRO activities in Tajikistan. But Alan asks, how active is ICRO in Azerbaijan and Tajikistan?
Okay, great questions. Thank you, Alan. So I can't speak a lot about Azerbaijan, although one of our colleagues in this project, Peter, has done some great work on Azerbaijan and on links, hasn't he? So
I just now put up a link in the chat box.
Brilliant, thank you.
Paper that we published on Azerbaijan.
But I mean, certainly, with Azerbaijan, again, it's a hand that Iran has to play very carefully. Iran cannot be seen in Azerbaijan to be, trying to promote an Islamic Republic there, despite, of the obvious confessional linkages between Azerbaijan and Iran because of the sensitivities Iran has over its large Azeri minority and the complex geopolitics around its relationship with Azerbaijan. But the ICRO has certainly, has an office in Baku. I don't know if it's still functional, so apologies. Very much on the kind of more low-key, religious commemoration, also serving the needs of Iranian expats, for example, in Azerbaijan. In Tajikistan, we had a lot more activity, and they're much more active. And it's probably one of the most countries where the ICRO are most active is Tajikistan. And that's obviously on account of the linguistic and cultural ties between the two nations. But that's also fallen victim to geopolitics. So just a very quick example, we had Iran hosting, in fact, in one of the Islamic Unity conferences I mentioned before, Iran hosted a Tajik opposition figure, one of the few opposition representatives in Tajikistan's parliament back in 2015. He came. That led to a rupture in Iran-Tajikistan ties. What happened? Iran's cultural offices, the ICRO offices, and the offices of the Khomeini Relief Foundation, who were doing development work there, they were shut down completely. So they fell victim to this kind of, rupture. And interestingly, you then had Saudi Arabia moving in there, providing funding, taking advantage of that rupture in ties. Things have improved now, but these things are, intertwined with those kind of geopolitical developments, and a little move like that can kind of rupture things. So yes, they're active very much in Tajikistan, but kind of on hold for the moment.
Okay, great. So our final 2 questions come from participants who posed questions earlier, and just in the interest of time, these will be the last 2 questions, and I'll just read them out both together and then hand back to you, Eddie, to kind of wrap things up. Marco Ferrario observes that there is mutual antipathy between Sunni and Shia groups often. And how does this factor into the relations between Sunni Palestinians and their sometimes benefactors in Iran? And then Ben Tua, again, kind of asking questions about religious minorities in Iran, notes that there's a fairly significant Christian population. We hear very little about this. So again, I guess a version of the earlier question about the Jewish population, do Iranian Christians ever feature in kind of some of the representations and content of Iranian religious soft power rejection?
Great, thank you. Two very, very interesting questions. Firstly, then to Marco. I mean, obviously, I don't think we can really talk about mutual antipathy. Obviously, that's a very broad statement. I'm sure you don't mean that applies to all Sunni and Shia. But in terms of the Palestinian question, I think it's a very interesting one. You know, and Iran will never, you know, certainly, or should I say, the Iranian government and actors involved in cultural diplomacy will never flag up any kind of antipathy. You know, particularly not in Sunni countries in which they operate as well. Iran is very keen on promoting unity discourses when it comes to the Muslim world. In terms of the Palestine, as I mentioned, the Palestinian cause is a huge, you know, central cause in the resistance axis, and you know there are very strong links, you know, between Iran and Palestinian factions, between certainly Hamas coming back into the fold of the resistance axis. You know, we had this rupture between Iran and Hamas momentarily because of Iran's involvement in Syria. Now, because you know, geopolitical currents are changing, and we're seeing moving together again as Hamas needs funding, and Iran, you know, is very happy to have a very active ally. So I think the Palestinian cause is used, you know, Iran can say, look, this is not, you know, we are not sectarian actors, we're utilizing this cause. This is a kind of a common unifying cause, and we as some of the only people now, especially in light of recent developments, you know, the so-called peace deals, you know, they're one of the few countries that are still rallying behind the Palestinian cause. So I think that is an answer to any kind of accusations of promoting Shia interests or sectarian interests. The second question was regarding the Christian community in Iran, which, as you rightly noted, is numerous. I mean, it's an interesting one. It's certainly in relations between, you know, Iran's historically had very good relations with Armenia, for example, and the vast majority of Christian population in Iran are of Armenian descent, albeit very long established, hundreds and hundreds of years, based in Iran. So that does form an element of the kind of cultural relation. So back in the Khatami period, for example, you know, we had this notion of dialogue among civilizations, and where interreligious dialogue was very prominent, and certainly Armenia that was used as an example of kind of interreligious dialogue on the basis of Iran's, you know, Christian Armenian population and those kind of links that have been developed historically over time. So it's kind of held up again. It's similar to the Jewish example, held up as an example of Iran as a multi-ethnic state whereby minorities' rights are protected by, you know, that's the government narrative which is promoted. So it does play a role, certainly, and the Armenian case is probably where that's most prominent. But then, you know, we have, you know, broader interreligious dialogue initiatives, you know, involving the Catholic Church and things like that as well, which Iran's historically been very, very keen on promoting.
Okay, wonderful. Well, as ever, Eddie, thank you so much for an incredibly rich and illuminating presentation and discussion to follow. So I will, in the chat box one more time, put up a link to the policy brief that this presentation is based on, in the hope that some of you will be inspired to read it and also to learn more about Dr. Wasnich's other publications on the same topic. So it just remains for me to thank our speaker for making the time to be with us today, and to all of you for joining us and for your wonderful questions. And we hope to see you again soon at another Berkeley Center webinar event. Take care, everyone, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.